Professor Singh has traveled and written extensively on Asian affairs, China's foreign and security policy issues, with special focus on China-India confidence building measures, as also on the arms control and disarmament, peace and conflict resolution, India's foreign and security policies as well. His latest book titled Revisiting Gandhi interrogates several strands of Gandhian design, articulations, and methods and ideals through 5 sections. The book presents the essential of humility and simplicity of Gandhi. This book is a must read for all those who seek to understand Gandhi in a way that is candid and inclusive. He is the guest of honor today. I welcome him. Professor Swaran Singh.
Thank you, Hatisham. Also, thank you so much to Professor Lakhvinder Singh, who is the president of Gandhian Cultural Community in Korea. And I'm sure with strength of his team and his own determination, this organization will definitely make a contribution in areas which are in increasing demand of stepping back and looking at where the world is going. Professor Lakhvinder Singh mentioned about enormous strides that South Korea has made in its economic rise. That is very noticeable. But that also any sudden change, especially sudden prosperity, brings its own challenges. And Professor Lakhvinder Singh did underline some of these. And I think the relevance of Gandhi in that context is obvious to all of us. Gandhi was not only deeply grounded in history, culture, religion, not just of India, but of major civilizations, but was also someone who could very perceptibly look at future. The issues that world is grappling today, for example, issues of sustainability, issues of climate change, they were not issues during the lifetime of Gandhi, but look at the way he lived. And one of the famous sayings of Gandhi is that my life is my message. So the way he lived, the way he articulated, the way he organized himself and his community has enormous amount of lessons to address issues that world is grappling with today. And that is why this enormous relevance of Gandhi to the contemporary challenges that world is facing becomes very significant. And a group like you, I think in that sense, has a responsibility to not just engage and understand Gandhian philosophy, Gandhian thought, Gandhian ideas, his revolutionary experiments, but also to spread that word that this is one alternative way of looking at how one should organize life around the world, which becomes fundamentally sustainable, livable, more humane, and more worthy of being human beings that we think is the most evolved of the living species that we know of. So in that sense, I'm honored and delighted to be part of this discussion today. And I'm hopeful that this initiative will see much more impact and visibility in Korea and maybe in the larger region around Korea. All of you are perhaps much aware of the strong connection that Korea has had with Gandhi. This is not very often debated in Indian circles, but I'm sure when you have people debating Gandhi in Korea, you are much aware of the very close linkage that existed. For example, when the recent Korean ambassador now in Delhi, Chang Ye-bok, when he came to Delhi last year in August, in 2019, I think, the day on 19th August, I think, when he presented his credentials to the President of India, he also visited Raj Ghat, which is the monument for Gandhi, and also the Gandhi Museum he visited. Now, very few foreign ambassadors would do that on the day of submitting their credentials. That means that the diplomat was clearly aware of the deep linkage that Korea has had with Gandhi, and not just with India, with Gandhi as an individual, as a person. For example, in 1926, there was a very famous owner editor of a newspaper called Tung Ilbo, and the newspaper's owner editor was Sung Soo Kim. He wrote a letter to Gandhi in which he says that you are not a stranger for Korean intelligentsia, Korean aristocracy, Korean people, Korean intellectuals. You have not just inspired us, but you are actually seen here in Korea as our own leader. Now, that letter is very significant letter to understand the kind of close connection that Korean people, Korean scholars had with Gandhi. And then there are, of course, several other insinuations. Scholars have done work of the famous March 1st movement of the Korean liberation from Japan in 1990. Was that aware of Gandhi? Was that inspired by Gandhi? Was Gandhi's civil disobedience movement was some kind of an example to people in Korean, media at that time? It was known that Gandhi at that time was publicizing a very revolutionary strategy of boycotting British products. And that had inspired many people, and thousands of, particularly again, young students had led that March 1st, 1919 liberation movement of Korea, in which, of course, we talk of 33 very popular leaders on top. They were clearly aware of Gandhi's civil disobedience. But more interesting linkage became, because this liberation movement also, people, scholars have estimated, had led to about 12,000 plus people being killed by Japanese. And Gandhi had written about it actually. In 1910, Gandhi had even earlier written about his awareness of the aspirations that Koreans had for liberation and independence. And particularly, he wrote an editorial in Indian Opinion, the newspaper that Gandhi used to run, in January of 1910, about how the Prime Minister of Japan, Hirobumi, was assassinated by one of the activists or protesters or liberation struggle participant, Ang Jun-gyung. Gandhi wrote an editorial on that subject. And there was familiarity and awareness on both sides. And I'm talking here of Gandhi because Gandhi is beyond India for me. So Gandhi, I'm looking at Gandhi as an iconic philosopher, leader, who himself has an enormous link and following in Korea in that sense. So that constant connect between Korea and Gandhi was very strong and stayed through the liberation movement. And this was again very strongly revived more recently. You would again remember that in 2019, we were celebrating the 150th birth anniversary of Gandhiji. And United Nations General Assembly held a special session on contemporary relevance of Mahatma Gandhi to the world. And you would remember that this event was happening in September of 2019. And in that particular event, the president of South Korea, Moon Jae-in, delivered a speech where he devoted enormous amount of part of his speech on Gandhi. And particularly quoted something which is very interesting. And he quoted Gandhi to say that Gandhi had said that there is no path to peace. Peace is the path. And he tried to explain how the very foundation of United Nations is clearly embodies that sentiment. So that was a very great tribute in that sense from President Moon Jae-in in that event, which was to then, sort of lead to 2nd October being declared as International Day of Nonviolence. Now, United Nations every year, we around the world celebrate 2nd October as International Day of Nonviolence. Now, what is equally significant is not just the speech of President Moon Jae-in. This resolution that this should be declared as International Day of Nonviolence had originally been adopted way back in June of 2007, on 15th June 2007. So I talked of President Moon Jae-in giving a speech on 150th anniversary, where UN General Assembly is celebrating a special event on relevance of Mahatma Gandhi to contemporary world and makes a speech. That's one strong connection. Other connection is that famous General Assembly resolution which had created this day. And while on 15th June 2007 this resolution was adopted by General Assembly, same year only in January, another famous Korean, Ban Ki-moon. Ban Ki-moon had become Secretary General of United Nations in January of 2007. And by June, first major activity that his taking over saw was that General Assembly adopts a resolution to declare 2nd October as International Day of Non-Violence. So even the contemporary great iconic leaders of Korea have shown their not just awareness but great engagement and understanding and appreciation of Gandhian philosophy and Gandhian ideas. So I think Korea can be in that sense from East Asia one country where we can see a very fertile ground to revive debates on Gandhi, to bring to the front the current relevance, contemporary relevance of Gandhi. And I was carefully listening to when Professor Lakhvinder Singh highlighted several contemporary problems that the modern, much prosperous life in Korea is today facing. These are new challenges, but also how one can particularly engage the youth of Korea now to begin to understand the kind of timelessness that Gandhian philosophy has in it. In fact, there are global debates now whether the GDP growth rates should be the only yardstick to measure national development. A very small country in India's neighborhood, Bhutan, has created some concept called National Happiness Index. Becoming prosperous does not mean becoming happy. These are two very different things. Or being at peace. And therefore, I think Gandhi has to make an important contribution. And Korea, because of its century-old linkages with Gandhi, Korea, because of its current iconic leaders being fully aware and engaged with the philosophy of Gandhi, creates a very fertile ground. And I'm sure that not just people like you are dedicated, maybe India at the national level, in terms of national leadership of India, also understands that important integral connect between India and South Korea, which is where Gandhi becomes a bridge. So you would perhaps remember, this is more recent, that in February of 2019, sorry, there is a flight going over there. I live next to international airport of my university is very close to the international airport in Delhi. So
yes, I remember.
The flights that go overhead sometimes creating noise. So I was saying that when Indian Prime Minister recently, actually before we went into pandemic, had visited Korea in February of 2019, he also unveiled one more bust of Mahatma Gandhi in the famous Yonsei University. So I think this awareness of Gandhi being an important bridge between India and Korea, whether it is the Korean ambassador's visit on the day of his submitting of credentials when he comes to Delhi, or whether it is Prime Minister Modi going to Seoul and unveiling that bust and making a very important speech at that university to addressing young students. Not in many countries' relationships, Gandhi is as writ large and as visible and as influential as Gandhi becomes when we look at connections between India and South Korea. So in that sense, you already have an advantage in pushing this agenda, this idea forward. Particularly as Professor Lakhvinder Singh said, this is very contemporaneous. This is the time when we need to again bring back Gandhi and revive Gandhi. And thanks for showing that book of mine, which talks about revisiting Gandhi in terms of looking at his relevance to world peace and national integration. So I think most of us need to revisit Gandhi and he becomes really very, very significant in a contemporary challenges that we face. And the link between India and Korea, I think, makes Gandhi all the more important. So my compliments to this team of Gandhian Cultural Community in Korea, and I'm very confident that your work will be receiving great appreciation and engagement among the Korean youth. Korean youth is now becoming globally visible, of course, for their games on internet, for their music and other issues. But I'm sure there are several Korean youth who are equally grounded in ideas and issues of philosophy and issues of society that societies face. So my best wishes for the team and my best wishes to all of you to take this very, very important task that you have taken upon yourself forward. And my best wishes, and I have great confidence this will soon begin to become far more visible, and you will begin to receive far greater engagement among the Korean society and Korean interlocutors who are also equally keen in engaging Gandhi and engaging India. And thank you very much for involving me in this today's discussion. It's my honor. And
Thank
with
you so
that,
much, Professor.
I hand it back to Atisha.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Professor. That was a very informative session.